There exists an ancient principle in geopolitics. No great power tolerates rival military presence in its immediate sphere of influence. For 201 years, the United States enforced this principle through the Monroe Doctrine. But this week, Chinese Type 052D guided missile destroyers docked in Havana Harbor, and what we are witnessing is not simply a naval port visit. It is the death of American hemispheric dominance and the arrival of multipolar competition in Washington's own backyard. We are talking about warships carrying YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles with 290-mile range, positioned just 90 miles from Florida. And Jake Sullivan at the National Security Council knows exactly what this symbolizes. The United States can no longer exclude rival powers from the Western Hemisphere. I have worked inside these institutions. I have analyzed the classified threat assessments. And I tell you this with absolute certainty. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this moment represents the culmination of 6 decades of failed American policy toward Cuba and 2 decades of aggressive Chinese expansion into Latin America. From the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 to the economic embargo that has cost Cuba $130 billion, Washington has treated the Caribbean as its private lake. And now, China is proving that era is finished. Let me take you through the systematic brutality that created this vulnerability, because you need to understand how American arrogance built the conditions for its own strategic defeat. In 1962, the United States imposed a comprehensive trade embargo on Cuba. Not limited sanctions, total economic strangulation. For 62 years, Cuba has been cut off from the largest economy in the world, located just 90 miles away. The United Nations has voted 30 consecutive times to condemn this embargo, with only the United States and Israel voting against. The economic damage is staggering. $130 billion according to Cuban government calculations, $1.3 trillion when accounting for depreciation of the dollar over time. But the cruelty goes deeper. The Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 prohibited foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996 allowed U.S. citizens to sue foreign companies doing business with Cuba if they were using property confiscated from Americans after the 1959 revolution. Washington was not content with punishing Cuba directly. It punished any country or company that tried to help Cuba. This is extraterritorial application of U.S. law, forcing the entire world to comply with American policy preferences. In 2004, the Bush administration tightened restrictions on Cuban-American family remittances. Cuban families in the United States could only send $300 per quarter to relatives on the island, and could only visit once every 3 years. Washington was literally restricting the ability of families to help each other, using human suffering as a tool of regime change policy. The cruelty was the point. Then in 2017, the Trump administration expelled 15 Cuban diplomats and reduced embassy staffing in Havana following the mysterious Havana Syndrome incidents affecting U.S. personnel. Whether those incidents were real attacks or mass psychogenic illness is still debated, but Washington's response was immediate escalation. In 2019, Trump activated Title III of Helms-Burton for the first time, allowing lawsuits against foreign companies using formerly American-owned property in Cuba. European and Canadian companies faced billions in potential liability. In 2020, the Trump administration designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, rejoining a list Cuba had been removed from by Obama in 2015. This designation cuts Cuba off from international financial systems, prevents World Bank and IMF loans, and triggers secondary sanctions on entities doing business with Cuba. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. During COVID-19, when Cuba desperately needed medical supplies and economic support, this designation made it nearly impossible for Cuba to receive international aid or conduct normal trade. The Biden administration, despite campaign promises, maintained every Trump-era sanction. In 2021, Cuba experienced its worst economic crisis in 30 years. GDP contracted 11%. Food shortages became severe. Medical supply shortages reached critical levels, and Washington watched with satisfaction, believing the Cuban government would finally collapse. So, what happened? China stepped into the void that American cruelty created, and Jake Sullivan, sitting in the White House Situation Room, now faces a strategic nightmare that is entirely self-inflicted. The National Security Council needs Cuba to remain isolated, weak, and dependent on American goodwill for any path to prosperity. But Washington simultaneously spent 6 decades making that goodwill conditional on total capitulation. You cannot starve a country for 62 years and expect it not to seek alternative partners. This is strategic malpractice of the highest order. Look at failed strategy number 1, the assumption that economic embargo would cause regime change. After 62 years, the Cuban government remains in power. The embargo did not topple the government. It did not create democratic transition. It created suffering for ordinary Cubans, while providing the Cuban government with a perfect external scapegoat for economic failures. Every food shortage, every infrastructure breakdown, every economic problem could be blamed on American aggression. Washington handed Cuban leadership the propaganda victory while achieving zero strategic objectives. Failed strategy number 2, the belief that isolation would prevent Cuba from finding powerful allies. During the Cold War, Cuba allied with the Soviet Union. The USSR provided $4 to $6 billion annually in economic support, roughly 25% of Cuban GDP. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Washington celebrated, believing Cuba would follow. Instead, Cuba survived the special period of extreme hardship and found new partners: Venezuela, China, Russia, Vietnam. The isolation strategy failed because other countries saw value in relations with Cuba, whether ideological, economic, or geopolitical. Failed strategy number 3, assuming Latin American countries would forever comply with U.S. preferences on Cuba. In the 1960s and 70s, most Latin American governments joined the U.S. embargo, severing ties with Havana. Today, every Latin American country except one has diplomatic and economic relations with Cuba. Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Colombia all conduct normal trade and diplomacy with Havana, despite American pressure. The Organization of American States voted in 2009 to lift Cuba's suspension. The inter-American system that Washington dominated for a century has rejected the U.S. position on Cuba. Failed strategy number 4, the cynical manipulation of Cuban-American voters in Florida. For decades, both Republican and Democratic administrations maintained the embargo primarily to win Cuban-American votes in the critical swing state of Florida. The policy was not designed to achieve strategic objectives in Cuba. It was designed to achieve electoral objectives in Miami. This subordination of foreign policy to domestic politics created a self-perpetuating system where rational policy change became politically impossible, even as the strategy obviously failed. And here is the bitter irony that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. You cannot declare war on your own neighbor for 6 decades and expect them not to invite your rivals to visit. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed in 1823, warned European powers against intervention in the Americas. President James Monroe declared the Western Hemisphere closed to European colonization and interference. For 201 years, the United States enforced this principle, intervening in Latin America more than 100 times since 1900. Guatemala in 1954, Dominican Republic in 1965, Chile in 1973, Grenada in 1983, Panama in 1989, Haiti in 1994 and 2004. The list is endless. But the Monroe Doctrine was never international law. It was a unilateral declaration backed by American military power. And power, as we are learning, is not permanent. China's arrival in Cuba demonstrates that the United States no longer has the capacity to exclude rival great powers from its hemisphere. The Type 052D destroyers in Havana Harbor are not just warships, they are a statement. The era of American hemispheric monopoly is finished. The economic numbers tell the story of China's systematic penetration of Latin America. Chinese trade with Latin America grew from $10 billion in 2000 to $450 billion in 2023. China is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. Chinese foreign direct investment in Latin America exceeded $160 billion between 2005 and 2023. The Inter-American Development Bank estimates China has committed $140 billion in loans to Latin American governments since 2005, more than the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank combined during the same period. Cuba specifically has become a major recipient of Chinese support. In 2022, China provided Cuba with $400 million in aid, including food, medicine, and industrial equipment. Chinese companies are investing in Cuban renewable energy, with plans for 14 solar parks totaling 1,000 megawatts of capacity. China is modernizing Cuban telecommunications infrastructure, replacing aging systems with Huawei equipment. The port of Mariel, just 30 miles west of Havana, was built with $680 million in Chinese financing and is designed to handle post-Panamax container ships. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, because his offensive realism framework explains exactly why China is challenging American regional hegemony. Mearsheimer argues that great powers seek to maximize their share of world power, with regional hegemony as the optimal strategic position. The United States achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere by 1900 and has used that secure base to project power globally. China, as a rising great power, seeks the same strategic advantage in Asia. But here is the twist Mearsheimer predicted. Once a great power achieves significant capabilities, it will probe rival hegemonies for weaknesses. China's presence in Cuba is exactly such probing. Beijing is testing whether the United States can still enforce hemispheric exclusion. The answer appears to be no, and that revelation has profound implications for the global balance of power. If China can operate militarily in the Caribbean, if Chinese warships can dock in Havana without triggering American military response, then the strategic geography that underpinned American global power for a century has fundamentally changed. Stephen Walt of Harvard, who co-developed balance of threat theory with Mearsheimer, would note that small states like Cuba balance against threats, not just against power. From Cuba's perspective, the United States is the threat, not China. Washington has attempted regime change, imposed crippling sanctions, and maintained hostile posture for 6 decades. China offers economic development, diplomatic support, and military partnership with no regime change demands. The choice for Cuba is obvious. Graham Allison, also of Harvard, has written extensively about the Thucydides trap, the dangerous dynamic when a rising power challenges an established hegemon. We are watching this trap spring in real time. China is rising, the United States is the established power, and Cuba is the territory where they are testing relative strength. Allison studied 16 cases over the last 500 years where a rising power challenged a ruling power. In 12 of those cases, the result was war. The question is whether the United States and China can navigate this transition without military conflict. So let's talk about the systemic collapse that makes this Cuban development possible. American power in the Western Hemisphere rested on 3 pillars: economic dominance, military superiority, and ideological appeal. All 3 pillars are cracking simultaneously. Economic dominance is eroding because China offers an alternative model. Latin American countries no longer must choose between accepting American terms for trade and investment or facing isolation. China provides infrastructure financing through the Belt and Road Initiative, without the governance conditions imposed by Washington. Chinese loans don't require austerity, privatization, or political reforms. From a developing country's perspective, this is vastly preferable. The United States lectured Latin America about democracy and human rights while supporting military dictatorships when convenient. China simply offers business deals with no strings attached. The numbers are stark. Chinese lending to Latin America from 2005 to 2023 totaled $140 billion. During the same period, U.S. lending through official channels was less than $30 billion. China built the Brazilian port of São Luís, the Ecuadorian hydroelectric dam of Coca-Codo Sinclair, the Argentine nuclear power plants, the Chilean telecommunications networks. This is concrete infrastructure that improves lives and economies. What did the United States offer during this period? Free trade agreements that benefited American corporations while decimating local industries, and lectures about governance from a country that elected Donald Trump. Military superiority is eroding because the United States is overextended globally. The Pentagon faces simultaneous challenges in Europe with Russia, in the Middle East with Iran and its proxies, and in Asia with China. The U.S. military cannot be everywhere at once. Defense spending is $877 billion annually, but that must cover global commitments. Meanwhile, China can concentrate forces in its priority regions. The People's Liberation Army Navy now has 370 ships compared to the U.S. Navy's 293. China is outbuilding the United States in shipyards, missiles, and drone systems. In the Caribbean specifically, the United States lacks the force presence it once maintained. The Fourth Fleet, reactivated in 2008 to focus on Central and South America, is not a standing fleet with dedicated ships. It is a command structure that borrows vessels from other fleets. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy maintained constant Caribbean presence to counter Soviet submarines and prevent arms shipments to Cuba. Today, that presence is sporadic and insufficient. Ideological appeal has collapsed because the American model is visibly failing. Latin Americans watch American cities decay, infrastructure crumble, inequality soar, and political dysfunction paralyze government. Why would anyone want to replicate this? Meanwhile, China lifted 800 million people from poverty in 40 years, built world-class infrastructure, and maintained political stability. Whatever you think of Chinese authoritarianism, from a developing country perspective, the Chinese model delivers results. The United States preaches democracy while supporting coups against elected leaders. Washington backed the 2009 coup in Honduras against Manuel Zelaya, supported the 2019 coup in Bolivia against Evo Morales, which later was reversed, attempted to overthrow Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela in 2019 by recognizing Juan Guaido, who had never won a presidential election, as interim president. This hypocrisy destroys American credibility. When you lecture about democracy while openly supporting coups, nobody takes your ideology seriously. Are you enjoying the analysis? If so, click subscribe now because this is exactly the kind of deep geopolitical analysis that corporate media will never give you. Join thousands of people who are waking up to how global power really works. And if you find this valuable, press like to help the algorithm show this content to more people who need to understand it. Leave me a comment. Where are you watching this from? I want to know how these dynamics are affecting your region. Your perspective matters, and this community is building collective understanding that transcends mainstream media propaganda. Now let's continue, because you need to understand how this impacts your life directly. This is not abstract geopolitics happening in a distant region. This directly threatens American security and economic interests in ways that will affect your daily life. When Chinese warships operate freely in the Caribbean, they can monitor U.S. naval movements, track submarine deployments, and collect signals intelligence on American military communications. The strategic advantage the United States enjoyed by having a secure rear area is disappearing. Your tax dollars are being wasted on failed policies. The United States spends billions annually maintaining the Cuban embargo, enforcing sanctions, and funding regime change operations that accomplish nothing except creating enemies. That money could rebuild American infrastructure, fund education, or reduce the deficit. Instead, it finances counterproductive policies that strengthen the Cuban government and drive Cuba into China's arms. Your economic security is threatened by the erosion of American influence in Latin America. The Western Hemisphere is America's natural trading sphere. 28% of U.S. trade is with Latin America and Canada. If China becomes the dominant economic power in the region, that trade will increasingly flow through Chinese financial systems, using Chinese digital currency, following Chinese rules. American companies will lose market access. American workers will lose export markets. Energy security is at stake. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, 304 billion barrels. Cuba has significant offshore oil potential. Mexico is the third largest source of U.S. oil imports. As China deepens relationships with these countries, American access to hemispheric energy becomes less certain. You are already seeing this with Venezuela, where Chinese and Russian companies dominate oil development, while American companies are shut out by sanctions. But here is the important nuance you need to understand. This is not necessarily catastrophic for ordinary Americans. It is catastrophic for American empire, but the empire's interests are not your interests. The Pentagon wants to maintain global military dominance. Defense contractors want to sell weapons. The national security bureaucracy wants to preserve its power and budgets. But do you benefit from American military bases in 80 countries? Do you benefit from endless interventions in foreign conflicts? A multipolar Western Hemisphere could actually benefit ordinary people throughout the Americas. When countries have options, when they can trade with multiple partners, when they are not subject to monopolistic terms from one hegemon, that creates competition, and competition produces better deals for everyone. If Cuba can trade freely with both the United States and China, Cubans benefit from access to both markets. If Venezuela can sell oil to highest bidders, Venezuelans benefit from maximum revenue. If Brazil can choose between American and Chinese investment based on best terms, Brazilians benefit from that negotiating power. The Monroe Doctrine system benefited American elites and corporations while often immiserating ordinary Latin Americans. United Fruit Company owned Guatemala's economy and overthrew governments that threatened its profits. American mining companies extracted resources from Chile and Peru while leaving environmental devastation. American banks trapped Argentina and Mexico in debt cycles. The good old days of American hemispheric dominance were not good for most people living in that hemisphere. What the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that the decline of American regional hegemony is not apocalypse. It is adjustment. For 2 centuries, the United States treated Latin America and the Caribbean as subordinate territories. That treatment was based on racial attitudes from the 19th century, on economic exploitation, and on military intimidation. The transition to a multipolar hemisphere where Latin American countries have genuine sovereignty and multiple partnership options is not tragedy. It is justice. Cuba has survived 62 years of the most comprehensive economic warfare ever sustained against a small country. The Cuban people have endured deprivation, sacrifice, and suffering because their government refused to accept American subordination. You can disagree with the Cuban political system. You can criticize human rights violations, but you cannot deny the fundamental fact. Cuba maintained its sovereignty despite 6 decades of American attempts to destroy it. That sovereignty is why Chinese destroyers can now dock in Havana Harbor. The transition is already happening. The world just has not fully processed what it means. Chinese military presence in Cuba is not some future threat. It is current reality. Russian military aircraft and ships have visited Cuba multiple times in recent years. Iranian vessels have docked there. The exclusion of rival powers from the Western Hemisphere, the core principle of American strategy for 201 years, is finished. Not ending, Finished. Your role in this moment is to understand the real dynamics, not the propaganda narrative. The establishment will frame Chinese presence in Cuba as unprovoked aggression, requiring American response. The truth is that American policy created this situation through 6 decades of failed embargo, refusal to pursue normal relations, and subordination of strategy to Florida politics. Washington had countless opportunities to normalize relations with Cuba, to end a pointless embargo, to treat Cuba as a sovereign neighbor rather than a target for regime change. Every administration chose continuation over reassessment. Stay vigilant, stay informed, because what happens in the Caribbean in the next 5 years will define whether the multipolar transition in the Western Hemisphere proceeds peacefully or violently. The United States faces a choice: accept that it can no longer exclude rival powers from its hemisphere and adapt strategy accordingly, or attempt to restore exclusion through military force and risk catastrophic conflict. The rational choice is obvious. Whether Washington will make it is much less certain. You are witnessing how the foundations of the world order are being reorganized, not just in Asia or Europe, but in America's own backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. Chinese warships in Havana prove it. The question now is whether American leadership has the wisdom to accept multipolarity or the foolishness to fight it. Your economic security, your physical security, and your children's future depend on which path they choose. Do not waste this opportunity to understand the forces that will shape your future.